Elated about having another son, Johnny Dowdle, a vice president of Great Lakes Carbon and a special assistant to George Skakel Jr., went on a non-stop 3-day bender, accompanied by his brother-in-law, Rushton Skakel. John was an alcoholic, but he hadn't had a drink in a long time, Rushton Skakel said later. I went to the wild parties with him Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. In my mind, it didn't translate into a problem. Well, Rushton, were you thinking? Father, who just had his 5th child, went on a 3-day bender and that didn't translate to you as a problem? This person who had been an alcoholic but hadn't had a drink in a long time and now is drinking for 3 days straight with his newborn in the hospital and that didn't translate to you as a problem? Maybe this makes sense now why it was your son that was accused of murder later on in life. Because if this doesn't translate to you as a problem, did anything translate to you as a problem? Anyway. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is True Denise, and today we're going to be reading The Other Mrs. Kennedy, and we are on part 7. And part 7 is entitled Chief Counsel's Wife, and I'm doing my best to get through this whole part together. It's not overly long, but it's also not going to be like a 30-minute episode. I don't know. We'll see where we go with this, but hopefully I can get through the whole thing because it's so good. Like, if you thought last episode was crazy with their parents being killed and a plane crash and then Ted Kennedy camping out at their house like some kind of a squatter, using all their servants, having them feed him, dress him, take care of him, and then sending the bill to the bereaved daughter. If you thought that episode was crazy, sit tight, friends, because it's murder and mayhem in this chapter, and I'm not even kidding with you. There's murder. There's mayhem. There's typical crazy Skakel drunkenness. There is every conceivable bit of drama that you could ever want, all in this one section. And it's like, like this chapter right here, let me just say this right now and then we'll get into it. This chapter is so incredibly juicy that if the entire, I've read entire books where the whole book, if I were to glean all the most interesting parts, this would be the most interesting part of like a 400-page book. Not so, friend. We're going to cover like maybe 20 pages. And it's crazy, 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 crazy. I've never read a book like this. I have no... Jerry Oppenheimer, dear man, you have brought it. You weren't kidding when you decided to sit down and write a book. And now makes me want to read all his books. Because I'm like, either you picked the most perfect person to write about because she was so crazy and came from so much crazy that there was just so much to talk about, or else you really understood the assignment when it is go write a biography. Because we don't want all the junk. We don't want all the boring stories and the, political drama that extends for pages and you can't follow it. We don't want any of that. We want the people who are drunken, in car accidents, murder, mayhem, people who don't know which way to go, people who are making poor decisions. That's what we want, and that's what Jerry brought us. Let me just tell you, I sat agape as I read. How about this chapter? Murder in the Bronx. Okay? We're talking about people suddenly dropping dead in front of their kids. This is maybe one of the craziest episodes I've done so far, and this whole book has been crazy. So I hope I'm not overselling it to you, but I'm telling you, I can't get over how insane this book is. Okay, let's get started. We got to talk about Hickory Hill, because Hickory Hill, as you know, if you know anything about the Kennedys, that was Robert Kennedy's home in Virginia, Northern Virginia. Now, this is a house that is a cast-off from Jack and Jackie. We'll talk about how it fell into the hands of Robert Kennedy. But, Hickory Hill is a name that is just synonymous with the Robert Kennedy clan. That was where they would go and have their parties and have their shindigs and all this. And when I tell you that it's just the Skakels replanted in Northern Virginia, there's no other better way to describe what's going on at this house. So, insanity ensues. Near the end of the Eisenhower era and the beginning of Camelot, Bobby reigned as the nation's ace rackets buster. Ethel had 3 more babies in 3 years, and the Kennedys finally got a home of their own. For Ethel, it was the happiest of times. Since being named to the high-profile post of Chief Counsel of Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, popularly known as the Senate Rackets Committee, Bobby, now in his early 30s, had quickly gained national prominence. His boyish face was featured regularly on the nation's front pages and on the evening's newscasts. The runt of the Kennedy litter finally had his own spotlight, squaring off in the hearing rooms of the U.S. Capitol with thugs, mobsters, and corrupt union bosses. Ethel, too, was beginning to garner media attention, a reflection of Bobby's growing fame. While he appeared on page 1, she was starting to show up regularly on the Society and Women's pages. Reporters could hardly miss her, the bouncy little brunette rushing into the Senate hearing room each morning with a cute friend or an attractive Kennedy in-law. "I like to see Bobby in action," Ethel told a reporter. "I wouldn't think of missing a session." Later, when her brother-in-law had become president, Jack heaped praise on Ethel for appearing at those hearings regularly and showing her loyalty. "Every day for nearly 2 years, Ethel sat watching Bobby," Kennedy declared. "She even looked at me once in a while." Jack had been one of the 26 senators on the committee. "With that loyalty, I decided she was my kind of sister-in-law." Ethel had already started proving herself, as one Skakel put it, more Kennedy than thou. Dulled by years of Mamie Eisenhower, the press corps found in Ethel a whole new kind of Washington wife. Cute, trendy, full of pep. With a house full of kids and pets and married to one of the handsome, rich Kennedy boys, Ethel possessed all the ingredients necessary to make for rattling good newspaper and magazine copy. Many of the women reporters covering in Washington scene found Ethel more natural than her haughty sister-in-law Jackie, and they gave her more upbeat, less critical coverage. Jackie just seems like the sort of person that is so pretentious. How could you ever have anything in common with somebody like that? And what I mean is this. We recall from Ask Not, the other Kennedy book we did before this, that told an anecdote, which I've heard before, where Jackie showed up for the first time to Hyannisport with a picnic basket full of champagne and caviar, and she came like dressed head to toe in some like designer outfit. And she did it so that the other women feel like grubby little bumpkins, in their, jeans and button-down shirts and, just whatever casual wear they were wearing. And she did it to show up and to show off and to make them feel small. Nobody wants somebody like that around. It's like you want somebody like that who can maybe decorate your house or something, somebody with good taste. But it isn't good taste to show up inappropriately attired for an event just because you want to show your wardrobe off. That's ridiculous. It's like, but why? Why do it? Why always make everything about you? So I can understand why reporters are like, oh, here's somebody who's normal, who can talk to us, who doesn't seem like she's always trying to hide behind this image. She doesn't seem like she's always trying to either say the right thing or not say anything. She's not like this aloof person who is constantly living behind some kind of glass that we can't penetrate. The book says that the image the press presented was that of the wholesome 50s TV sitcom housewife and mother. Donna Reed goes to Washington. "I just don't understand why anybody would want to write about me," Ethel said. But privately, she savored every moment of the limelight. "She told me she was tired of being overshadowed by Jackie all the time," noted one of her pals. Ethel clipped every story ever written about her. The woman had an ego. While she feared speaking publicly, worried she'd make a gaffe that would anger Bobby, Ethel would sometimes throw a bone to the newshounds. After Bobby's chief adversary, Jimmy Hoffa, was arrested, a pinch Bobby had orchestrated, Ethel told reporters it was one of the most thrilling moments of her life. "I'd never been to an arraignment," she gushed. "It was very exciting." But her appearance had infuriated Hoffa's attorney, Edward Bennett Williams, who, upon seeing Ethel at the courthouse, brushed past her, mumbling, "Why aren't you at home with the kids?" For years, Ethel would have it in for Williams, going so far as to try to have him fired as Georgetown University's counsel before they eventually made peace. Unbeknownst to most of the other spectators and press, Ethel spent much of her time at Bobby's hearings trying to overhear what others were saying about him. She'd then give him a summary of the critiques. This is such a weird little relationship that the two of them have, where it's like, and it seems like it was welcomed. My last episode, I was like, hey guys, how would you feel if your wife was always showing up? But the Kennedys seem to have really translated this not as this weird clinginess, but as being very, very loyal and supportive. And, here she is, like this little ear, always, sidling up to people, trying to figure out what they're saying about her husband, and then rushing back to tell her husband, okay, this is what so-and-so said, and this is what so-and-so said, and I think so-and-so thinks this about you. And instead of finding that aggravating, it seems like that was a functioning part of their relationship. Like he wanted her there to do those things. But she lives, as you'll see in this episode, she lives constantly in fear of making him angry. And I think that if he had been bothered by her presence, he certainly would have let her know, and she wouldn't have done it anymore. So this is not something that she is conceiving on her own that he wants. She's clearly been reinforced by his praise to do this, because she won't do anything he doesn't like. Even if that means cutting out friends, family, relationships. If he says no, She actively works to never do that thing again. During the committee's 2-hour lunches, Ethel usually went home and oversaw lunch with the children. A cook made it, a maid served it, and afterward 2 nursemaids put the little ones down for their naps. With everything under control at the house, Ethel drove back to the Hill for the remainder of the day's hearing. At night, Ethel had to help prepare 2 dinners, one that she would have with the children, and the second for her and Bobby, who rarely got home before 10. After they had a drink or two, the cook prepared Bobby's favorite meal, a medium steak and chocolate ice cream with chocolate sauce for dessert, which they'd eat in the living room under the big chandelier. Before going to sleep, Ethel and Bobby watched clips of the day's hearings on the 11 o'clock news and joked about the high pitch of his voice. Lights out at midnight. Then they were up again before 6 for an early horseback ride before Ethel drove Bobby back to the Hill for another day of hearings. By the time Bobby was pursuing Hoffa, the Kennedys had moved across the Potomac from their rented house in Georgetown to Hickory Hill, a small, by Lake Avenue standards, Civil War-era estate hidden from the road by huge trees and carefully trimmed ancient boxwoods in McLean, Virginia. Most recent occupants of Hickory Hill had been Jack and Jackie, who'd gotten the place as a gift from Joe Kennedy. Jackie had adored Hickory Hill, which was only 3 miles from Marywood, her girlhood home. But after she lost a daughter during an emergency cesarean in late summer of 1956, she couldn't bear to live there anymore. Once she recovered from the trauma, she and Jack, who'd recently lost his bid for the vice presidential nomination in the 1956 race, moved back to Georgetown, where Caroline and John Jr. would be born. After Jack and Jackie vacated Hickory Hill, Joe Kennedy gave the estate to Bobby and Ethel, who needed the space for their mushrooming family. The 2.5-story white brick house and the 6 acres of gently rolling countryside it sat on were perfect for them. There was plenty of room for the kids and pets to romp, and for Ethel to throw boisterous parties, shades of Lake Avenue. Around the same time Ethel and Bobby took over Hickory Hill, a house came up for sale next to Joe Kennedy's place in Hyannisport. The old man bought it and gave it as a gift to Bobby and Ethel. They were the first of the new generation of Kennedys to have their own home there, marking the start of what came to be known as the Kennedy compound. Ethel was overjoyed to have a home right next to her in-laws, whom she worshipped. "It makes me feel like a real daughter now," she told a friend. Meanwhile, her own family continued to grow. Ethel had her 5th child, Mary Courtney, on September 9th, named after Ethel's college chum, Courtney Murphy Benoist. Okay, just hang on for a second, you guys. As they begin to name the children, notice that they start to lose steam when it comes to originality. Now, a couple of the girls are named Mary and then a second name, which is typical in a Catholic family. But just let's just pay attention to these names, okay? Because I guess when you're coming up to like your 11th kid, you start to realize I didn't have enough names picked out, and we start recycling things. And I can't even understand. I cannot even conceive. Could you not have asked some of our friends, "Hey, I'm running out of ideas. Can you help me here?" Okay, but anyway, the first girl of this set is called Mary Courtney. At the same time, conducting hearings on the West Coast, Bobby came home for the birth but quickly departed. Ethel, at 28, was now the mother of 3 boys and 2 girls, the oldest going on 6. Over the next 3 years, she'd have 2 more children, Michael Lemoyne in 1958 and Mary Carey in 1959, 7 in her first 9 years of marriage. So we got Mary Courtney and now we got Mary Carey, okay? But later on, let me just skip to the chase. Later on, they're going to have another daughter who they name Carey. Okay, so I was thinking, okay, so we got Mary Courtney and we got Mary Carey, so they're probably going to go by Courtney and Carey, right? You'd think. Because unless we just, go by double names, maybe we go by Mary Carey and maybe we go by Mary Courtney. But now this third child that they're going to have a little bit in the book, they also name Carey, spelled with the same Kerry. Why do we have 2 Carries? And if we've got 2 Marys, and now we got 2 Carries. Really? Pick up a baby naming book or something. Anyway. Besides the children, the menagerie at Hickory Hill would multiply and grow more exotic over the years, initially including a 200-pound St. Bernard named Megan, an all-American poodle of mixed breed named Ruffy, and 2 horses for Ethel, Shalala and Magic Purse. Ethel's stable also included a pony named Toby, who would pull the children in an old wooden-wheeled cart, and 2 boxers, Angus and Shell, and their 6 puppies, who belonged to the Kennedys' horse groom. Soon there'd be a 2-year-old sea lion named Sandy who ate 10 pounds of fish a day, living in the swimming pool, and escaped one day just before Christmas. "It's like the National Zoo around here sometimes," said Dee Dunworth, Ethel's secretary at the time. I've just heard it all. A sea lion in the swimming pool that eats 10 pounds of fish a day? Did I read that correctly? I did. 10 pounds of fish a day? Who's in charge of that? In the swimming pool? So now I gotta swim around in the swimming pool with a sea lion who might bite my leg off and a bunch of fish particles? In the swimming pool? Like, come on, you guys, what the heck? Like, you can have, fun pets, but a sea lion? Where'd they even get a sea lion? How do you get a sea lion? You don't go down to the corner pet store and be like, I'll take one sea lion. How does that work? Well, over the next decade, Hickory Hill, with Bobby and Ethel in residence, would become the most famous Washington address next to the White House. Hickory Hill would be the nation's capital what Lake Avenue was to Greenwich, a place of hijinks and a source of gossip. The similarity between the two households was uncanny, if not surprising. Despite all the hired help, Hickory Hill was usually a mess, and would get progressively worse over the years. Ethel thought one of the funniest moments at the Senate hearing was when a tough Portland nightclub owner swore to Bobby that his joint was as clean as your home. Ethel, who took the word clean literally, remarked guilelessly, "If he could have seen what the kids had done at the house this morning, he wouldn't have thought that comparison was so good." Insiders who knew Ethel intimately choked back laughter when the Home Fashion League of Washington, a group interested in promoting good taste in design, chose her as its Outstanding Homemaker of the Year of 1958. Ethel, who got a silver bowl, was praised at a luncheon by the league's president for her ability to maintain a, quote, functional, smooth operating home. At the time, Ethel didn't even know where the butter was kept in the kitchen, but in her best self-effacing manner, she graciously accepted the honor. "It's the first time I ever received an award. I'm so excited. When my husband left me this morning, he said, 'They haven't seen the house yet, so you'd better get that award before they do. He told me to hustle over before you changed your minds.'" Typical of the ambiance at Hickory Hill was the zaniness that occurred late that one spring afternoon in 1957, when Ethel played hostess to 300 guests from the 10th District Women's Democratic Club of Virginia. Just before the women arrived, water began seeping from a third-floor bathroom to the second floor. Ethel rushed upstairs and found that one of the children had turned on all the taps. Ethel returned downstairs just in time to find 4-year-old Joe pouring a soda on the white damask sofa in the drawing room. Just like old times. During the party, one of the Kennedys' big St. Bernards roamed and urinated freely among the guests. At 8, when everyone was leaving, 5-year-old Kathleen decided to troop off the grounds and down Chainbridge Road with her little brothers, Bobby and Joe, behind her. One of the departing guests spotted the little band and ushered them home. As George Terrian noted, 3 weeks after Ethel moved in, Hickory Hill was like Lake Avenue all over again, out of control, and it would stay that way. In every way imaginable, Ethel would run her place just the way Big Ann did. No discipline, no controls. It was another Skakel household all over again. Okay, we're off to a roaring start, but you guys, it's about to get a lot crazier. This next chapter is called An Embarrassment for Bobby, and really we're ramping up the embarrassments for Bobby, okay? So this chapter is crazy. The next chapter, people are being murdered. Okay, is that correct? Oh, wait, no. We got some crazy before we get to the murder, but don't worry. I had no idea there was so much drama in this family. We already know about the murder that had involved Rushton Skakel's son years later. I had no idea about this one, and I don't think very many people did. Okay, anyway, we're not there yet. I'm sorry. I don't mean to get ahead of myself. I can't believe it. Okay, this chapter is called An Embarrassment for Bobby, and this would have been an embarrassment. Says, as point man for the Rackets Committee, one of Bobby's prime targets was the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Bobby had been told by a friend, Clark Mollenhoff, Washington's editor of the Des Moines Register, that his own investigations had suggested a potpourri of illegal activities, embezzlement, intimidation, and mob infiltration within the union. On Mollenhoff's advice, in part, Bobby began a systematic probe of the union's leadership, Jimmy Hoffa and David Beck, the International's arrogant, melodramatic president. A month after the televised hearings, during which Beck and his son, Dave Beck Jr., repeatedly invoked the Fifth Amendment under a barrage of tough questions from Bobby, a bizarre event took place in Greenwich. Bobby had always thought of his in-laws as a potential source of embarrassment, but this particular incident also raised serious questions among the Kennedys about Ethel's prudence and common sense. It seemed that every time she felt she'd proven herself to the Kennedys, something would happen, usually having to do with her own flesh and blood, that would place her back at square one. The incident in question occurred during one of the many wild parties thrown at the sprawling Greenwich estate of Ethel's brother George and his beautiful alcoholic wife Pat, described as the golden couple, fun-loving, wild, anything for a laugh. On one occasion, a guest crippled from the waist down by polio and confined to a wheelchair was pushed into the Skakel's pool. And at another time, at a party for an important Great Lakes client, a soused Pat Skakel tore an emerald and diamond necklace worth thousands of dollars from around her neck and threw it into the pool, where it disappeared. Side note, how does a necklace disappear at the bottom of a pool? It's not like you threw it into a lake, right? I mean, it's like, how hard were y'all looking for it? Did it just get sucked up into the filtration system? And if it did, we're tearing the filtration system out, you guys. Anyway, knowing Bobby's feelings, Ethel had distanced herself from the family shenanigans. But on a Saturday evening in mid-August 1957, she threw caution to the wind and became an active participant in one of George and Pat's nutty party stunts. Wary, Bobby had shrewdly stayed away that night, claiming business appointments in Washington. It began when Claire Gildemeister, the society editor of the Stamford, Connecticut Advocate, telephoned the Skakel house to check reports that a big soiree was scheduled. Pat Skakel confirmed some of the details. The party was being given in honor of Ethel, who was 3 months pregnant, and that Bobby would be there too. Then she added the kicker. David Beck is coming. What a great story, thought Gildemeister. The good guy and the bad guy at the same party. Excited for the scoop, Gildemeister arranged to have a freelance photographer attend. That evening, he took pictures of the guests, but when he asked to photograph Dave Beck, he was told that the Teamster honcho was not feeling well and had left early. However, he was invited to take a picture of Dave Beck Jr. and his wife. Also in the photo was George and Pat Skakel, their little girl Kik, and Ethel. Back at the paper, someone checked and learned that the younger Beck wasn't married. Something was fishy. The picture was held, but the story ran on Monday morning and was picked up by the Associated Press, which reported Dave Beck Sr. and Dave Beck Jr., labor leaders under fire of the Senate Labor Rackets Committee, were present at a party which was also attended by Robert F. Kennedy, chief counsel for the Rackets Committee. It was confirmed here today. The story also quoted Dave Beck Jr. as saying of Bobby, "Although our policies differ, socially we get along famously." When other reporters began making inquiries, Pat Skakel fessed up. "It was a gag," she reluctantly admitted. "All I can do is apologize. It was a prank, just a prank. All of my 200 guests were in on it and went along with it. Everyone at my party knew it was a gag, except apparently the photographer. I'm sorry for any inconvenience that the gag caused." She disclosed that the couple in the picture was actually Skakel friends Patty and Peggy Loughran, the daughter of legendary New Jersey Democratic boss and one-time Jersey City mayor Frank Hague. Mary Begley, who was at the party, acknowledged years later that the Skakels pulled the stunt specifically to embarrass Bobby. "Until that party, I had never thought that Ethel was that goofy to go along with something like that," Begley added. "Ethel, George, and Pat thought it was amusing, but Bobby was incensed." So was the Stamford Advocate. Embarrassed and furious, the paper's managing editor, E.R. McCullough, ran a page-one apology to the Becks. Ethel had gone along merrily with the prank. "It was crazy," she said in dismissing the incident. Ethel was acting under Bobby's instructions when she told the reporter that the stunt was a dumb thing to do, said George Terrian years later. But privately, Ethel thought it was great fun. Bobby was furious and told Ethel, "If those bums you call your family ever do anything like this again to embarrass me or my family, you're going to be in real deep shit. You're in deep shit anyway." In the end, though, it would be the Kennedys, not the Skakels, who would do themselves in with their own highly publicized scandals. Okay, let's do chapter 52, shall we? This chapter is tragic, shocking, truly mind-blowing. And it isn't even the height of the chapter. We're not even at the climax of the crazy yet. This chapter just goes to show that the continual necessity of constantly having fun, driving the car without brakes, and speeding towards a cliff, there is an inevitable end to it. You know, it's on the one hand, you know, I'm looking at the Kennedys, who people have always said, oh, there's a Kennedy curse. And since reading more about the Kennedys, I'm like, no, it's just a Kennedy lifestyle. It's not a curse. You make choices, and then there's consequences. Same for the Skakels. I mean, I would almost say that the Skakels and the Kennedys were living within the same curse. And what the curse is, a complete and total inability to predict the outcome of bad decisions. Anyway, this chapter, I won't prolong it anymore. It's just, how can people continue to compound and compound and compound poor decisions. Anyway, A Tangled Web is the name of this chapter, and it begins by saying that Ethel and Georgianne were both pregnant in 1957. Ethel with her 6th, and Georgianne with her 5th. Georgianne's husband used to quip that Ethel would grab the brass ring in the baby race between the two sisters because Bobby, quote, wants to show his family he has the biggest balls. By the fall of 1957, Georgianne was the mother of 3 daughters, little Georgianne, the institutionalized Alexandra, Anne, and a son, John, who was born with a foot deformity. Georgianne, who'd gotten pregnant 3 months ahead of Ethel, thankfully had a smooth time and an easy delivery. On Friday, November 8th, she gave birth at Greenwich Hospital to a healthy boy, whom she and her husband named Jimmy after her brother. Elated about having another son, Johnny Dowdle, a vice president of Great Lakes Carbon and a special assistant to George Skakel Jr., went on a non-stop 3-day bender, accompanied by his brother-in-law, Rushton Skakel. John was an alcoholic, but he hadn't had a drink in a long time, Rushton Skakel said later. I went to the wild parties with him Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. In my mind, it didn't translate into a problem. Well, Rushton, were you thinking? A father of 1, 2, 3, 4 children who just had his 5th child went on a 3-day bender, and that didn't translate to you as a problem. This person who had been an alcoholic but hadn't had a drink in a long time and now was drinking for 3 days straight with his newborn in the hospital, and that didn't translate to you as a problem. Maybe this makes sense now why it was your son that was accused of murder later on in life. Because if this doesn't translate to you as a problem, did anything translate to you as a problem? Anyway, that Sunday night, Dowdle, who was wan and had always seemed somewhat sickly, returned exhausted to Sursum Corda. He spent some time with 7-year-old little Georgianne, and then father and daughter napped together. When they awoke, the child sensed that her father wasn't feeling well. He told her he had slight pain in his chest. He asked her to go to her room so he could rest. After a fitful sleep, the child awakened before dawn, padded down the hall to the bathroom, opened the door, and found her father lying on the floor in his underwear. I thought that Daddy was playing a game, she said years later. But in fact, he wasn't breathing. At 39, John Dowdle had died of what the family said was a massive heart attack. The house was soon filled with shocked Skakel friends and relatives. Little Georgianne, not told what had happened to her father, was sent off to spend a week with close family friends, while Rushton Skakel was given the unenviable task of telling Georgianne that her husband and the father of her newborn was dead. On the day of the pontifical mass and funeral, all the family was there, including Ethel and Bobby. Jim Skakel and Pat Skakel Cuff, who'd flown in from Ireland, brought little Georgianne home, telling her, as she recalled years later, "Your daddy's in heaven." And that was that. Dowdle's sudden death floored the Skakels. But the widow's impetuous decision a few months later to marry Bobby's chum George Terrian, whom most of them had come to abhor, left the family shocked and fragmented. As an outsider, Terrian was viewed by the suspicious Skakels, especially Ethel, as an opportunist who had insinuated himself into the family's inner circle, securing a cushy job for himself with Great Lakes Carbon. "That bastard is out to marry a rich girl, and it doesn't matter who," Ethel told Martin McNeely. "He'll take advantage of Georgianne. It's pathetic." Ethel also feared that Georgianne, who had essentially been on the wagon since she'd had her first child 7 years earlier, would start drinking again if she married Terrian, a heavy drinker himself. Despite his growing dislike for Terrian, Bobby ordered Ethel to stay out of it. She was now a Kennedy, not a Skakel. If Ethel and her siblings could have had a say as to whom Georgianne married, they would have chosen Martin McNeely. Despite his true sexual preference, McNeely had quietly worshipped Georgianne for years. Despite what they have said over the years, I think the Skakel boys knew all along that Martin was gay and accepted it, said Mary Begley. But they were very fond of him and certainly preferred him to Terrian as a husband for their sister. How bad must George Terrian have been if the boys were like, "Please marry a gay man," rather than George? But Terrian stepped in there and took her away before any of us could say boo. He wanted her money. Had George Skakel, the father, been around, things might have been different. The only member of the family who didn't seem to mind was Rushton. Well, of course, he's got the poorest judgment of the lot so far. Just 3 months after John Dowdle's death, Georgianne confided to Rushton that she and Terrian were in love. "I said, boom, don't wait a year, marry him now," Rushton remembers. Despite the family's hostility, Terrian moved into Sursum Corda a day after Dowdle's death. Ethel, her siblings, and their friends were appalled. "I was kicked out of my bedroom and George took over my bedroom and I was moved into the nursery," little Georgianne recalled. She firmly believed that her mother had decided to marry Terrian as a form of escape. Mother was a 41-year-old alcoholic with 5 kids who was scared to death, and George was a known quantity, she said later. But I don't think she ever was really in love with him. There were only 2 men she ever really loved, her father and my father. In the period just before the wedding, the George Skakel Jr.'s, the Begleys, and Claire and Tom O'Neill, who headed RKO General, flew to New Hampshire on the Great Lakes Carbon Plain and held a summit meeting to discuss possible ways of stopping the wedding. But Georgie Ann found out and flew into a rage, and at that point there was nothing anyone could do. On October 4th, 1958, a very disgruntled Skakel family and their friends gathered at St. Paul's Church in Glenville to discuss Georgie Ann Skakel Dowdle becoming Mrs. George Terrian. I certainly was well aware that Ethel and the rest of them didn't want me to marry Georgie Ann, said Terrian later, but I told them to F off. Terrian's brother served as best man, and little Georgie Ann and her sister Anne were her mother's attendants. But none of the other Skakels participated. Ethel and Bobby, along with the others, just sat in the church fuming. Ethel was quite bitter, recalled her brother Jim. She said, "This is just revolting. How can this go on?" Ethel finally told Georgie Ann what she thought. I felt, who the hell is Ethel to comment on why 2 people should get married? My answer to Ethel was, it's none of your business. Privately, Jim believed the marriage was one of convenience, that Terrian wanted to marry a rich woman, and Georgie Ann got to keep the Great Lakes perks by marrying Terrian, the company vice president and director. All of that was important to her, he said. After the ceremony performed by Big Ann's close friends, Reverend James Fox, abbot of Our Lady of Gethsemane Abbey, the Trappist monastery in Kentucky, everyone returned to Sursum Corda for a small reception. My God, George and Big Ann's wake 3 years earlier was a happier affair, said Fox. While the gloomy party was underway downstairs, the newlyweds were upstairs in their bedroom arranging the pièce de résistance of their questionable union. At that moment, no one in the family was aware that Terrian had insisted, and Georgie Ann had agreed, to have reciprocal wills drawn up. Terrian had asked Dick McAvoy, Great Lake Carbon's corporate counsel, to prepare the papers quietly and bring them to Sursum Corda for signing immediately after they said their vows. The candles on the wedding cake were still warm as McAvoy witnessed the new Mrs. Terrian putting her signature on the paper, authorizing that all her fortune go to her husband, and only her husband upon her death. Terrian signed a similar will, though he had virtually nothing to his name. In years to come, Georgie Ann Skakel Dowdle Terrian's will would cause enormous dissension and would even lead to violence within the family. One day after the wedding, the Terrians left for a honeymoon in Spain. When they returned, said little Georgie Ann, Mother suddenly looked around and said, "What the hell did I do?" And she dove into the bottle. It's not going to get any better, because listen to this situation. 10 months later, Terrian formally adopted little Georgie Ann and her brothers and sisters. On August 22nd, 1959, Georgie Ann gave birth to her 6th and last child, a daughter who was named after Terrian's mother, Des Niguez? I don't know. We all know I can't pronounce names. A few weeks later, on September 8th, Ethel had her 7th child, a daughter whom the Kennedys named Carrie. See, we already have a Mary Carey, spelled Kerry, and now we have another Carrie. What are we supposed to do with all these Marys and Carries? Whatever. At Sursum Corda, George and Georgie Ann Terrian drank constantly. In her sober moments, Georgie Ann often warned her children never to get in a car with the Skakel, or their adoptive father, at the wheel for fear that someone would get killed because of their drinking. Her fear nearly became a reality shortly after Des Niguez was born. The mishap occurred in Vermont in a snowstorm with George Skakel Jr. at the wheel. Because of her stepfather's irresponsibility, little Georgie Ann was riding the back seat. Terrian was seated between George and Pat Skakel in the front seat. All of them had been drinking when they slammed head-on into another car. We always had walkers with us, a drink that you walk out of the house with, said little Georgie Ann. Everybody always had a drink in their hand, and it was always in a glass, and it was always in a car. Little Georgie Ann remembered seeing the approaching headlights and hearing the crash. She came to in a lot of pain. She crawled out of the car and found her stepfather, her uncle, and her aunt bleeding profusely. There wasn't much left of the face of the driver of the other car, but he was still alive, she said. The ambulance came, and they had all the plugs in George, and I was very sure he was going to die, and this wasn't very long after I found Daddy dead on the floor. Terrian spent almost 2 months recovering in a hospital. George and Pat each suffered broken noses. When Bobby heard about the accident, he turned to Ethel and said, "Watch, they'll all kill themselves, and then we won't have to worry about any of them anymore." Ethel remained silent. Okay, now this is our last chapter. There's actually one other chapter to finish off this section, but I don't have time, but it doesn't matter. It'll go fine into the next one, but we cannot skip this one. It's called Murder in the Bronx, and oh my goodness, what? This is crazy. Okay, buckle up. Although the near-fatal accident in Vermont did not become public, Ethel continued to fear that a scandal involving the Skakels would jeopardize her still tenuous position in the Kennedy clan and cause irreparable damage to her marriage. Avoiding such a situation became a priority by 1958, when Jack Kennedy, having won a resounding re-election to the Senate, quietly began planning for a 1960 presidential run. Bobby, still chief counsel for the Rackets Committee, would be actively involved in Jack's campaign. It was during this time that Ethel received horrific news from Rushton and Georgianne about the teenage son of their first cousin, Betty Skakel Medale, a poor relative whom Ethel had ignored over the years. Unlike Ethel, Betty had faced incredible hardship. By the time she was 18, she had married a, quote, good-for-nothing, named Alvin Czar, and she had a baby. The Czars were subsequently divorced. At the start of World War II, Betty met and married another man of little means, George Medale. In search of work, they migrated to New York City, moving into a 5-floor tenement on West 102nd Street. George Medale was often unemployed, and Betty was constantly pregnant. She would have 9 children in all. During those difficult years, she found herself skimming the society pages and the gossip columns for items about her millionaire relatives living a short train ride in a world away in Greenwich. Virtually destitute, she eventually contacted her Uncle George, Ethel's father, who generously offered her financial help, sending his niece a monthly check for $125. When George Skakel died, her cousins, Rushton and Georgianne, made certain the checks continued to be sent. Only Ethel remained aloof. Well, I had some bitter words against Rushton in the last chapter, saying he had poor judgment, but at least he cares about this poor relative. But of Ethel's aloofness, Medale says, she had nothing in common with me. I was a poor relation, dirt poor, and poor relations can be embarrassing. On February 11, 1958, Betty Skakel Medale went to her $75 a week job as a charge plate puncher in a downtown credit agency. Her husband George was working the 4 to midnight shift as a desk clerk at the Manager Vanderbilt Hotel on 34th and Park, where his take-home pay was $68 a week. 8 of his 9 children, ranging in ages from 2 to 18, were at home. An $80 a month, 6-room, first-floor flat in the bleak High Bridge housing project in the Bronx. While Betty Medale was at her dreary job dutifully cranking out charge plates for less than $2 an hour, Ethel was at Hickory Hill in the 9th month of her 6th pregnancy. A staff of servants and a coterie of friends were catering to her every need as she waited to go to Georgetown University Hospital, where a private suite and private nurses were ready for her arrival. The only similarity in the otherwise disparate lives of the first cousins, Betty Skakel Medale and Ethel Skakel Kennedy, was the fact that both were perpetually pregnant. Before she left for work that February afternoon, Medale did some chores around the apartment with the help of her son, a stocky, bespectacled, moon-faced 15-year-old, Francis Michael Medale. A month earlier, the teenager had been expelled from Cardinal Hayes High School in Manhattan for causing trouble and failing 3 classes. Twice prior to being expelled, he'd run away from home. Despite his poor behavior and grades, young Medale was known as the professor among friends and acquaintances. He was highly intelligent, articulate, and an avid reader. Among the meager possessions in the family's apartment was a bookcase filled with Shakespeare, Homer, and Dickens. But a sudden change had come over the boy in the past year or so, evidenced by his running away, his failing grades, and his destructive acts at school. Once his mother came home from work, opened the refrigerator door, and found a dead shark on the shelf. Thin, fragile, and worn, Betty Skakel Medale went to work that February day anxious about her son and worried about leaving him alone. But the family couldn't make ends meet without her small weekly paycheck. After his mother left the apartment, Mike Medale wandered outside where he encountered strawberry-blonde 7-year-old Kathleen Hegman, a playmate of one of his sisters. She and her family, 9 children in all, lived 2 floors above the Medales. Mike told Kathleen that there was a box on the roof of their building that he had to get, and he offered her a lollipop and 10 cents if she'd help him carry it down. They rode up together on the elevator to the 14th floor roof, the last time Kathleen, a student at Sacred Heart Parochial School, was seen alive. Late that afternoon, Kathleen Hegman's 12-year-old sister ran into the family's apartment. "Mother," she cried, "there's a little girl on the ledge, and I think it's Kathy." Mrs. Hegman ran to the living room window, and her husband went to the one in the kitchen. My husband screamed, "My God, it is Kathy!" And both ran downstairs, but it was too late. Their little girl's broken body lay on the stone canopy a few feet from the kitchen window and just above the building's entrance. As the hysterical Hegmans and their shocked neighbors gathered outside, Mike Medale walked up to Detective John Murphy at a nearby precinct house and coolly told him, "I just pushed a little girl off the roof." In a signed confession, the boy said, "I grabbed her by the throat and I choked her. I choked her and I knocked her down. I choked her again and I picked her up. I carried her to the edge and pushed her off." Not long after, Deputy Inspector John Hulk ordered the teenager to reconstruct the crime for detectives. He didn't even flinch when we walked up to where the corpse was still lying. I've never seen anything like it before. The Medales, notified of what had happened, arrived home in time to see their son being taken away in handcuffs. Betty Medale didn't know where to turn. But as soon as the story appeared in the papers the next day, she got a telephone call from Rushton Skakel. He asked me how he could help. He asked me what he could do. He said he was there for me. After that, Rushton went out of his way to be helpful and kind. Okay, I take back what I said earlier about Rushton. This is very generous of him. I mean, this is an extreme situation. And I wonder to myself, if I had a relative whose son had pushed some other little child off a building, I don't know if I'd be so quick to run to help. And I know that's a blight on my personality. But Rushton didn't even, skip a beat. It was like, what can I do? How can I help? What do you need? Well, good for Rushton. Rushton Skakel recalled later, "My heart went out to Betty, and so did Georgie Ann's." Cynical New Yorkers were shocked by the cold brutality of the murder, which played out on the front pages for days. Headlines screamed, "Mother's agony! What should I have done?" On the roof, "A boy of wild compulsion." "Psychiatrist looks at school terror." "She was just too young to know of evil." Overnight, the ghastly crime became a national story, appearing in the weekly newspapers and in papers around the country. "This case got an appalling amount of publicity," said Betty Medale years later. "I was literally shocked into stillness. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't hear. I couldn't see. It was just dreadful. Dreadful." But none of the papers ever connected Medale to the Kennedys or the Skakels. Georgie Ann Dowdle at Sursum Corda, planning for her marriage to George Terrian, read the terrible news and offered comfort and aid to her cousin. Georgie Ann said, "Why don't you come and spend some time with me?" And I did. This was an extraordinary kind of invitation because our contact up until that point had been casual. Not everyone would stick their neck out at a time like that, Betty said. Georgie Ann and Rushton alerted other members of the Skakel family to their cousin's plight, and they responded by expressing concern and willingness to help in any way possible. They all asked what they could do, said Medale. All of them wanted to help, except for Ethel. "I was present when Georgie Ann called Ethel to tell her what Betty's son had done," said George Terrian. Georgie Ann thought that Ethel, through the Kennedys, might be able to get some expert help for the kid, a psychiatrist, a lawyer, whatever. But Ethel was beside herself. The first thing she said was, "I have to let Bobby know. We have to keep this quiet. My God, Chuck will have a fit." Meanwhile, Mike Medale was committed to Bellevue Hospital for psychiatric evaluation. "If it is determined that the boy had capacity and knew the nature of the crime," declared Magistrate J. Randall Creel, "he will burn in the electric chair." Ironically, the same day that follow-up stories about Medale's indictment on first-degree murder charges were running in the papers, a wire service photo also was published of a jubilant, smiling Ethel lying in a hospital bed holding her newborn son, 8-pound Michael Lemoyne Kennedy, in her right arm as a proud Bobby patted the baby on his tummy. The caption under the picture read, "Here's another Kennedy." The baby's baptism was held in the chapel of the Apostolic Delegation in Washington. Georgie Ann, in one of her few visits to Hickory Hill, attended as the baby's godmother, with Ted Kennedy as the acting godfather. Ethel and Bobby invited Life magazine to photograph the event for an article called "A Debut into the Burgeoning Family. The Clan Takes in Bob Kennedy's Son." Jack, whose daughter Caroline was 4 months old, was quoted as saying, "Mother and father seem to get so much happiness out of us that all of us want a big family too. Bob and Ethel will get there first, but all of us will be close behind." The upbeat piece showed the Bob Kennedys seated on a couch in Hickory Hill, a glowing Ethel holding Michael in a blanket on her lap, Bobby gazing adoringly at her, surrounded by their other 5 children, and the St. Bernard named Megan. The layout appeared in Life, April 24th issue, which appeared on newsstands a week after the court-appointed psychiatrist determined that Mike Medale was insane when he killed Kathleen Hegman. He was committed to the Matawan State Hospital in Beacon, New York. After her son was incarcerated, Betty Skakel Medale learned from Georgie Ann that Ethel wanted the scandal kept under wraps. Said Medale, "Ethel was aware of Michael's situation, and she was worried it might affect Bobby and Jack politically. Her attitude was that Bobby didn't need any of this poor white trash scandal attached to his family, that it would cause political problems." But Georgie Ann felt that Ethel was out of line. Georgie Ann thought that that was the most ridiculous thing she'd ever heard. The idea that the son of an Irish bootlegger could be sullied by anything like an insane murder. When Betty Medale visited her son at Matawan, she'd often stop in Greenwich to see Georgie Ann, Rushton, and Ethel's sister Anne, with whom she had become friendly. But Ethel never once spoke to Medale. A year after Mike's incarceration, the Medales moved to Garden Grove, California, where their lives stabilized. There she helped care for George Skakel's aging spinster sister Margaret, Ethel's and Betty's aunt. At 21, Mike Medale was released from Matawan. He became a child of the 60s and 70s, said his mother later. He demonstrated and burnt draft cards. She saw him for a brief time after he was released, and once again in the early 1980s. In 1993, she did not know whether her son, going on 50, was alive or dead. As Ethel had hoped, the press never connected the Medale case to either the Skakels or the Kennedys. Her efforts to keep everyone quiet had been successful. Years later, another murder, involving another young female victim, this time in Greenwich, would envelop the Skakel family once again. This time, the finger of suspicion would point at one of Rushton's sons, and Ethel would again fear scandal. We have to stop there. But friends, what did we just read? And here's the thing. It's like, as much as I want to say Ethel was out of line for not wanting to help this family member, where was Ethel? Why wasn't Ethel doing the right things? I have to say that I feel for the place that she was in. She's got this very controlling husband that, has told her what she needs to do over every little step of her life. She also lived in a time when, it's not like you stand up to your husband and tell him how it's going to be. That's not the way it was. You did what your husband told you to do. And especially being attached to this powerful political family, it would have been very easy to think to yourself, I better not rock the boat, because even if you weren't married to this politically powerful man, even if all of your actions and everything you did was scrutinized to where your husband is constantly breathing down your neck over everything and you can't do this, you can't do that without him being angry with you, you would not go out of your way to, suddenly stand up to him when there's murder and mayhem involved, right? I understand why Ethel didn't reach out. And I also feel like I kind of understand what the Kennedys are saying too, as far as, even as ridiculous as it might be, that the public would give the side eye to the Kennedys because one of Ethel's cousin's kids had murdered someone, as ridiculous as that is. The press can make anything seem like it's a valid reason for your concern, and the press can write any number of stories making it seem like if you don't question the Kennedys on the fact that one of their own would marry somebody who's got a relative who's capable of this, what's the matter with you? I understand why the Kennedys didn't really want their name associated with this gruesome murder. Would you want your name associated with somebody who pushed a child off the roof? I can't say that I would be running for that. So as much as I wish that Ethel could have risen up to help this relative in any way that she was capable of doing, I also understand why this was not the moment or the occasion in which she stood up for her cousin. And I also feel like any number of us, even without all the political connections, would be a little bit wary about this. I mean, maybe I'm just exposing the hardness of my own heart, but I have to tell you that if I had a cousin whose kid killed somebody, I feel like I'd be like, wait, what happened? Why? I don't know, maybe because I think about all my cousins and I think if any of them were in any danger, or not danger, but in any hot water and I could help any of them, I know I would help them. So I don't know, maybe I'm just not able to translate what this story is saying, because I feel like I would have been like appalled and shocked and scared if I knew somebody whose kid choked a little 7-year-old and threw them off a roof, right? I mean, it feels like you would just struggle with what to do there. But anyway, I also think that, and this is my last thing because I really do have to go, but I also think that it's kind of crazy that whenever there's somebody in the family with money, everybody who doesn't have money thinks that that family member needs to start, passing out money and checks. And I think if you have money, it's awesome if you could be the sort of person that would use their money towards a good cause. If you've got extra, be helpful, God has blessed you for a reason. But the expectation that that person with money owes me something because I don't have anything, and because they have something, then I should get something because we are related, I don't get that. That's some crummy behavior to me. That's handout-ish. That's like, where's mine? it's like, well, I'm sorry that you made poor choices in life and you married people that weren't good for you and you had kids with these people that were no good and then you got divorced and then you moved to New York and then, you know, your husband can't keep a job. And it's like, I understand like Betty's life was hard, but I also think that Ethel should not have to bear the brunt just because she was born into a wealthy family and then she married somebody who's wealthy. I don't feel like then there needs to be this sense that she has to pick up the pieces of Betty's life and that, you know, she owes Betty something. She could have been nicer to Betty, like not maybe ignored Betty's existence. It seems like she did go out of her way to be like, a Betty who, you know? But this idea that people with money owe those who don't have money, I don't think that that's true. I think they should want to do the right thing and to help people, but I think that it needs to always be from the proper motivation. It can't be because there's always a handout from the poor relatives. I don't know, maybe I'm sounding like a horrible person here, but these are my true thoughts. So you guys weigh in. You tell me what you think. What would you do? If you had a relative whose kid murdered somebody, would you be running to help that person? Or would you be like, wait a second, what happened? And would you feel like it was your burden to bear if they were in a financial hard spot? Would you feel like because you had money, you needed to help them? Again, the desire is that we'd all be in a place spiritually that we would want to help those who have less than. My whole contention is not that we shouldn't help those who have less than, but there's an expectation that I'm not doing well in my life. That person over there is, who's related to me. They owe me something now. That's what I'm saying I don't totally understand. Anyway, I'm just gabbing now. I must get on with the day, but I'll see you guys later. Bye.